So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm not from Wisconsin. I'm from Alaska, but I hope that you'll find what I have to talk about today helpful. Melanie and I have been working on some of the marketing aspects of cut flowers over the last 3 or 4 years. Maybe more like 4 or 5 now, actually, now that I think about it. And we were fortunate enough to obtain a grant 2 years ago to do more in-depth work. And so if you've attended the Urban Small Farmers Conference in the past, I've talked about florists a couple of times. I've talked about wholesalers, but today I'm going to talk about consumers specifically. So I'm going to talk about the study that we did, kind of give an overview of the consumer survey and look at the results of that in terms of what consumers are looking for in terms of a number of things. And then we'll also specifically look at our kind of pricing aspects of labeled bouquets and stuff that we did in the survey. And then I'll give you some conclusions. I'll say this is an early run at this. We have a lot more detailed analysis of what we're going to be doing and publishing fact sheets and other things like that to provide more in-depth information. So one of the things that, and this is just some background, and those of you who grow flowers are, going to be obviously very aware of this, but the U.S. market is actually a pretty large market. People spend about 6.3 billion a year. Per capita spending is $170 annually. And then we buy a lot of cut flowers, 10 million. We source the majority of our flowers, I'm going to say about 80%. If that's not quite correct, Melanie, let me know, but from Netherlands, Ecuador, and places like that. But we have seen a lot of increased production in U.S. and West states in the last 6 to 10 years. And so especially here in Utah, as the Cut Flower Growers Association has grown, Melanie's been working a lot of production, those types of things. We're seeing a large increase in the number of growers that we have. And some of it has to do with some of the great season extension and other climate appropriate production techniques that have been developed at Utah State and the surroundings. So given that, people are used to purchasing flowers that have come a long way. Kind of what is their general feelings about preferences for local cut flowers? What would they want to see? What types of labeling would be helpful in terms of what's locally grown, or their sustainability labels, or fair trade, these types of things. And so really the focus was to examine their preferences and their pricing for flowers that are grown here in the Intermountain West. And so we want to kind of look at their motivations, their attitudes, and then that kind of will able to us to really customize target markets and really focus on maybe what your niche as a grower is. So another thing I do is I've spent a lot of my career looking at the importance of specialty labeling programs. And so we have integrated that here as well. In other words, local organic, sustainability labels, those types of things, what programs and characteristics are preferred, and then how might growers serve these markets, if so. You may be familiar with, in Utah, we have the Utah Zone program, and then our surrounding states, if you're from Idaho, Nevada, Wyoming, they have their own local labeling programs as well that can be used as an example, as well as, of course, organic and other things like that. So we did a consumer survey of general consumers in the Intermountain West states. And so we have basically the 6 primary states there. We had 607 respondents. And we did this through Qualtrics response system. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But basically, we asked them a whole set of questions related to their purchasing habits of cut flowers, as well as other types of ornamental and houseplants and these types of things, kind of their attitudes and perceptions about cut flowers, their general demographics, their familiar knowledge of labeling programs, such as Utah Zone. And then we did a couple of sets of questions. We call them choice experiments. Auctions is where we basically ask people a number of questions to try to elicit kind of what their pricing would be and what they value bouquets and things like that. I'm not going to go into depth on this, but this was our demographics. We had Qualtrics sampling set to reflect actual demographics of the area for education level, age, annual income, state of residence. We did have a little bit more, a high percentage of women and married persons in the sample than would be typical. So I don't know if that's an issue yet, it's something to keep in mind. So we had more people buying cut flowers about several times a year, which makes sense, right? Birthdays, Valentine's Day, these types of things. We had about 30% once a year or less, and then maybe 5%, 4% weekly. So we had kind of a broad spectrum, but definitely several times a year was the most common. And they spent at the time of purchase approximately $57.10. So you'll notice there that I have all the yes or the no, and I'll explain what I mean that in a minute. We gave some information to some people and not to others. And so the yeses got the information and the no's didn't. And you can see that made a difference. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Purchase reasons. As you can see there, we had home decoration, love or affection were once a year or more, slightly more than that. And then we had Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, birthdays coming in at about once a year. Veterans Day, Memorial Day, Father's Day, which makes sense, came in probably closer to never. What do they consider in their purchases? So this is interesting. So appearance, freshness, price, quality were by far the most important, followed by color, fragrance. Interesting, you'd think that, you know, they would want them to last, right? But vase life, stem length, and those types of things didn't really wasn't really something, but maybe they don't really understand what that means, which is always a concern, you know, when you do these types of surveys. We certainly can't give them the full rundown of the definitions of everything. Origin was less of a concern, so that may play later when we look at our willingness to pay. Locations, overwhelmingly grocery stores, florists, followed by multi-purpose stores, and then farmers markets were the #1 direct-to-consumer place where they were purchasing cut flowers. Cut flower varieties. So this is a long list that was given, and you can see that roses, tulips, sunflowers, daisies, dahlias, these types of things. When we drill down a little bit and we just look at least 10% of the people chose, so we've restricted the data a little bit here. We see roses, tulips, lilies, daisies, these types of things were the preferred cut flower varieties by far, and that makes sense. These are very common ones. I was a little surprised at sunflower. Colors. A lot of consensus here between red and orange, purple, yellow, pink, white, and cream. They all came out pretty high there in terms of the number of respondents who chose them. And then another kind of contingent at blush, blue, salmon, and burgundy. But you can see some clear groupings there and differences. Gray, brown, other, green, those were less colors that they were less interested in. Bouquet color schemes, the bright and bold tones, so yellow, red, white, deep blue were more preferred, and then with muted pastels, light tones coming in second there. It's perceptions and attitudes. I thought this was really interesting. This is a new area that I've been looking at in terms of I've always done fresh produce and looked at that, and so our perceptions and attitudes around fresh produce are really different. So, but in these types of questions, the highest ranked ones were flowers give me a sense of joy, give me a sense of peace, make me feel happy. So that was really interesting. I thought there's a lot of mental health issue perhaps here that are coming in, a lot of a sense of positivity. Also, you see lower round for those of you who are growers, uniquely colored flowers was very popular. Some other things that were had a high ranking were I have flowers at home, so these people generally like flowers in the home, and then also it's interesting, they had a high ranking on I would buy more flowers if provided with a longevity vase life guarantee, although they didn't choose vase life high on the purchase propensity in terms of characteristics. Okay, now we're starting to look more about some of the types of labeling that could be used on bouquets and things like that. And overall, so let's just look at the all category because that's all respondents. Again, I'll talk to you about what the information yes and information no means in a minute. You can see that locally grown labels they were most familiar with, followed by organic, GMO-free. A lot of flowers come in Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade International, especially from overseas, and those were not nearly as well known, although most people said they were somewhat familiar. They'd probably seen it before, that type of thing. And again, this is I think I know what I mean kind of thing. We don't really have a way of testing all of these at once per se. We have done on surveys in the past testing, do you really know what certified organic means, for example, but I haven't done that here just because we're dealing with so many, dealing with 5 different labels. When we ask them about specialty labels considered in their purchase decisions, again, locally grown by far the highest, which is great because we have those programs in our states. That's something that you can sign up for fairly straightforward in terms of using. Also natural, which doesn't have a specific USDA definition, which also came in pesticide free, these types of things, organic, and those types of things. And so this is all products, not just cut flowers. And so that's why you see grass fed and pasture raised and these types of things. Especially purchase frequency. You can see that they had purchased at least several times yearly something that had a locally grown label. And then they had purchased probably at least once yearly some of these other things. Sustainability labelings less so, such as Rainforest Alliance, for example. Another thing I wanted to look at, I actually presented a form of this at an academic conference last week, and people asked me, like, is organic even a thing for a non-food product? And it is. It is possible to do our organic certification on non-food items. And I wanted to kind of see the differences between the two. And it's interesting that if you look at the differences in means between the questions about organics at the top of the table and the question about local at the bottom, that local was more positively rated for fresher, smell better, better quality, last longer, but we're less rated for better for the environment. And so people are seeing that organic label is a sign of environmental friendly. So that's what we see here. Okay. On to pricing, which I think most of you will probably appreciate. So in academic marketing terms, we have this term called consumer willingness to pay, which is essentially a premium over, a completely non-labeled or typical product. For those of you who've seen me present in the past, you've probably seen me show that, organic fruit, has a premium of $2.50 over, the traditional. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So we asked, like I said, a number of questions, and I'll show you what those look later in a second, to try to obtain the willingness to pay in terms of pricing for one 18 to 22 stem rack bouquet. We did a choice experiment, which is essentially taking people through bidding. In fact, I think that I have that here, so I'll just show you. So they do 2 sets of 8 questions that have option 1 and option 2. And then they show what the bouquet looks like, and they have the corresponding labels there. And so they can pick option 1, option 2, or if you look lower on the right hand side, you'll see the none. So they have three choices. And so we take them through a number of questions like this. We ask them to think about actual purchasing in the grocery store. We give them something called cheap talk, saying, you need to think about your budget, all this thing. Anyway, after they've done this about, let's see, 16 times, okay, then we feel like we've had a fair assessment of what their actual willingness to pay in terms of pricing would be. The next thing we do is we take them through an auction procedure, which is much easier. It lists the different types of labeling. They put on a scale, what they would pay. And then we basically, then we do a random draw. And if the price of what they would pay exceeds, then we provide them with a coupon. So anyway, it's motivated to try and tell the truth, even though we're not teasing out. It's kind of a more direct type of questioning. So with the 18 to 22 stem wrap bouquet, we asked about 3 different labels and labeling combinations, which were certified organic, locally grown, and Rainforest Alliance. Again, this is what the choice test looks like. Before they did any of these questions in terms of the willingness to pay, I asked them, would you want to know what the definitions of these labels are? Are you curious? We had 284 people say yes, 323 say no. And I won't read all these, but these are the definitions that we gave them that either came from USDA definitions or from the actual labeling company itself. So like Rainforest Alliance website. So we had close to 40, little over 40% get this information. I can't verify if they read it completely, but it's interesting to see how this information plays out in the results. If we look at the auction results, I'm still doing analysis on the choice experiment. This is for this full sample, so all of those, not just those who had information or didn't. And you can see here that the locally grown single label had a higher mean price, and this is total price, than say, for instance, certified organic, although that was close behind, or Rainforest Alliance. With the combined labels, locally grown and Rainforest Alliance was slightly, and organic was highest, followed by locally grown and Rainforest Alliance. And so you see at the bottom, the non-labeled, so that was their average willingness to pay was $18.27 for this bouquet. And so having these labels made a pretty large difference. It's between $5 and $7 for some of these per bouquet. And I have the specific numbers here a little bit later. If we look by information group, you can see that those that received the information had a higher willingness to pay for all of the different labeled and the non-labeled. Interestingly here, organic came out a little higher than locally grown for the yes information group. And again, I also feel like here that some of these people, and I can tease this out a bit later, might have already been cut flower enthusiasts who just wanted more information. And so we have to think about that in our results. And so it's not probably just an information situation, but it also could be people who are already buying more or had more flowers in their life. And because of the prior questions, we can tease that out. Okay. So some overall results, and I have a couple slides here of this. So the key things that they thought about in their purchasing decisions for cut flowers were quality, price, appearance, and freshness. Brand origin, texture, and stem length were much lower on the thing. Rose lilies, tulips, daisies, sunflowers, preferred varieties, white, pink, red, and orange, and also stated an interest in unique colors. And then for bouquets, the bright and bold tones were preferred. The grocery stores and florists most common, makes sense. And then of course, farmers market for the direct to consumer marketing. Respondents purchase flowers seemingly for some, extend more sensitive reasons, for some mental reasons, enjoying the smelling, piece of joy. make them feel happy. So this is great. It's funny. It's funny because people comment on my presentations with all the flowers, many of them from Melanie's test sites, and how bright the presentation is and how it makes them feel good to see a presentation with flowers in it. They're most familiar with locally grown labels. Makes sense, and Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade were the least known, which makes sense to me. Those who received label definitions were willing to pay more. And the locally grown had the highest willing to pay for a single label, which was about a $5.50 premium. And they mentioned that local flowers last longer, are fresher, better quality, and benefit local farms, but the organic flowers are seen as more environmentally friendly. Label combinations of locally grown and Rainforest Alliance had the highest willingness to pay with a $7.27 premium. So again, that's about a 30% increase over the non-labeled product price, which is pretty good. So some conclusions and suggestions. Definitely a large interest in local flowers. So you know, that we see that with the interest in the locally grown designation. 46% of the sample wanted more info and were willing to pay more. The yes group is willing to pay $2 premium over the no group for the non-labeled bouquet alone. Okay, so again, a lot of interest. And you know, I think there's definitely room to grow as well. Next to quality and appearance, locally grown organic labels provide opportunity for premiums. We talked about that. And I guess one suggestion, obviously, know your market. I probably say this every time I present, but who are they, where do they shop, and why? So sales location makes a big difference. Grocery stores and florists were most common by far. However, some of those others possibilities in terms of purchase locations definitely had a following there. And so, you know, it may be that your market is purchasing somewhere else. It may be gift shops, it might be farm stores, it might be farmers markets. So definitely take a look at that. And if you're already producing and selling, pull your customers and just make sure that you're getting them to the right place. And then also, which came through, which is highlight the sensory aspects of the flowers. You know, people talk about smelling them, touching them, making them feel happy. And so it's interesting, a lot of times at, you know, at farmers markets, we see they provide tasting opportunity for fruits and things like that. And I think definitely maybe providing a way to highlight those sensory aspects of the flowers at the markets could make a big difference in terms of smell, coloring, those types of things. And I believe that is about what I have. I added here to slide. We have a ton of resources at USU. Again, like I said, this project's been going for a while. I have a number of fact sheets, presentations, a directory of florists on my cut flower marketing website that you see here. And I can only say that there's a lot more to come with that. Like I said, we're just getting started on analyzing this data. We also did a data collection with farmers markets consumers that we're analyzing. And then we still have other stuff we're still working on with previous surveys with florists and wholesalers. So there's already a lot there, but there's a lot more to come. And then of course, Melanie at her Small Farms Lab, she has a ton of fact sheets on production, on budgeting, and those types of things. So a ton of resources at USU and probably other places, but we have so much now here that I think that's a good place to start. And there'll be a lot more forthcoming in the next year, for sure. Because again, we still have a lot of more stuff to do. Specifically, I'll be looking at target markets with the consumer survey data that I just talked about. And with that, I will leave it open to questions.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Kynda. We certainly couldn't do this work without your collaboration and Ruby and Claudia. It's really a whole team to bring
Yes,
this cut flower crop together. So thank you so much for this
oh, you're welcome.
research that you've provided. I have a question for you, and if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. But so someone who's worked with many types of agricultural products, what was the most surprising to you from this survey?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think, you know, primarily having worked with food in the past, you know, people have a different reason why they buy things, right? And has more to do with, either health or taste or appear, like, those types of things. And here we definitely see a lot of other factors at play, including, like I mentioned, some emotional or mental health stuff, more making people feel happy. That's a new aspect of the research. Obviously, I did my homework, and that's why we included a lot of those things in the questioning. In terms of, the past literature on this topic. And actually, that's an interesting thing too. There was some flour research done, cut flour consumer work done in the late 90s, mostly from a professor at Michigan State, who I know. She's now retired, but she also ended up working in the food realm as well, and that's how I know her. And then a little bit in the late aughts, like 2009, 2011, and then like nothing after that. And so things have changed, and a lot of those works, looked at certain aspects. I tried to include as much as possible here without getting, tiring the respondent. And so I think we have a lot to tease out here. But yeah, it was, a lot of and if you think about it, people buy these things for special events, Mother's Day, Valentine. And so there's a lot of aspects of it that are totally different from food. I'm just not used to, I guess, but not surprising. I mean, anyone who works with flowers would be like, yeah, duh, right? So
well, I like how I mean, the labeling to me is mind blowing on how much that can add price
yeah.
wise, but then thinking about it in terms of the senses and how to really capture that on the markets. Um,
Yeah.
I'm gonna
So,
have to think on that.
do I just have a quick second here?
Yep, and then there is a question in the chat
Okay.
you've got plenty.
Um, so with fruits and vegetables, one of the main drivers of wanting to buy local, a lot of it is supporting local growers. It's green space. It's, some of these um intrinsic, feel good stuff. And I think that's what you're seeing here too. It's supporting local growers, even adding more to the scenario than just the emotional stuff that we talked about. And so I think and the great thing is that we have those labels, USD organic, that's another level of record keeping. You have to pay for inspection, all these types of things. But participating in a geographic labeling program in your area is more straightforward, and less of a financial burden for sure than some of the other programs.
Indeed. So to ask you the question that's in the chat here, do people pay a premium for wedding flowers that I think it's our premium and custom?
Uh,
Might be a bit outside
My
the
thought
scope
is
here.
yes, but I didn't ask specifically, that's not in this particular study. But I think yourself and any of the growers here can say that, yeah, that's definitely, there's a lot more, the price is higher for custom designs in wedding flowers.
Yeah, indeed. And that adds a little bit of extra, shouldn't say a little bit, but extra work on the flower growers end too in working with wedding clientele. But the farmers would be great for answering a question like that.
Right.
So,
Another thing I'd like to
oh,
point out real quickly is that while, people had a lot of interest in local, flower origin was ranked really low on the aspects that they buy. And so there's going to be, probably 75–80% of the market that just wants to walk in the grocery store, grab something and go, and they're not going to pay attention to anything. And that's okay. That's not your market. And it makes sense, especially if you're only buying something once or twice a year. Flour is also expensive, so there's a lot of budgetary issues there. And so just like the fresh produce and some of the stuff that Barney was talking about, people are a market for specialty stuff like this, like locally grown cut flowers, because of a reason. They value it. And it's usually a smaller proportion. You're not going to sell to everyone. So please keep that in mind. Our grocery store is a market for you. Could be, Could be. It depends on the location and the types of things that they have going, what their target market is, basically.